There is no birth in fire, only death, and from that death, if the Emperor so wills it, something greater may rise. I remember only fragments of the boy who once walked the marble halls of Terra Bones, still soft, eyes still curious. He is gone now, burned away in ritual and agony. What remains is a husk, stretched thin by centuries of genecraft, pain threshing, and the whispered promises of ascension. My name is no longer mine. My voice, now modulated by the vox grill embedded beneath my golden helm, carries no memory of that child. And yet, in the silence between wars, I sometimes wonder if some ember of him still smolders inside this armor of living myth. We are the 10,000, the last line, the Emperor's final word before silence. To wear this armor is to accept a truth few mortals could comprehend, that existence itself is a battlefield, and we are the blade held at the throat of the end. This is not a tale of glory. It is not a tale of war. It is the story of becoming, of sacrifice so complete it erases identity, of duty so vast it reshapes the soul. This is what it is like to be forged into the Adeptus Custodes. Before we descend into the golden forges beneath the palace, where flesh and faith are melted into one, take a moment in honor, not algorithm, to mark this chronicle. Share it, if you must, with those who would glimpse the cost of true loyalty, and subscribe, not for me, but for the echo of humanity that still dares to seek the Emperor's light. I never knew what they saw in me. Perhaps it was a genetic quirk, some buried strand in the helix that glowed faintly under the cogitator's eye. Perhaps it was chance. But I remember the moment well, though it comes to me now like a dream glimpsed through a cracked helm. I was 6 years old. The spires of terror stabbed the heavens above, shrouded in smog and reverence, and the streets below buzzed with the low hymn of a billion lives, each insignificant, each precious in its ignorance. My mother worked in the census vaults, her hands stained by ink and data foil. My father, I have no face for him, only a name I can no longer speak. On the day they came, the world stood still. There were no warnings, no sirens, just a flicker in the lights of the hablog, and then the silence of authority. They arrived in robes so pristine the grime of terror dared not touch them. Their voices were not raised, their movements were not fast. They simply pointed, and the serviquill scribes beside them made notes that would erase my name from every archive I had ever touched. My mother wept, not loudly, but with the breathless quiet of someone who understood that resistance would only steal the meaning of her grief. I remember how her fingers trembled when she kissed my forehead. I did not understand then why she clung to me like she was already mourning. I did not understand the weight of her whisper, "Be more than we are." Her voice was the last warmth I knew for many years. We were led into the transport like livestock, not by cruelty, but by necessity. There were others, boys like me, and some younger, some older. None of us spoke. Perhaps we were too afraid, or perhaps we already sensed that we were no longer children in the way the world recognized. The air in the transport was sterile and cold. No windows, no clocks, no names. We were stripped of identifiers with quiet efficiency, and so began the slow unraveling of everything we were. The facility was beneath the surface of terror, deep beneath, beyond the sight of the stars, below the dust of ancient wars. The halls were not cruel in appearance, no chains, no screams, but there was a stillness that gnawed at the mind, a stillness born of absolute control. We were not addressed as people. We were units, evaluated, examined, exposed to light that peeled back the skin of our souls. They took our blood and our memories, though they left the latter to fade on their own. The first night in the dormitorium, I could not sleep. Not for the hardness of the slab that passed for a bed, but for the absence of sound. No voices, no breath, just rows of children staring at the ceiling, all of us pretending we were not afraid. And in that silence, I heard the first whisper of destiny, not from a voice, but from the hollow that had begun to form where my past used to be. It was not long before the tests began, though test is too gentle a word for what followed. We were examined not just for strength or intellect, but for compliance, silence, recovery. Some were taken after the first round and never returned. No reason was given, no ceremony. One moment they slept beside us, and the next their bed was bare, their numbers scrubbed from the board at the end of the hall. It taught us something more effective than any lesson. Visibility is a danger. Attention is a blade. Stay quiet. Endure. Each morning began with the voice of a servitor, its vox grill hissing like a dying wind. We were made to kneel for the catechisms of submission, ancient litanies intoned by memory and pain, not faith. None of us understood the words, not fully, but we learned the rhythm quickly. A missed syllable brought a shock. Not enough to maim, just enough to teach. The priests of the genitorium monitored us from above, their faces hidden behind augmetic masks shaped like golden skulls. When they spoke, it was through filtered tones, devoid of care or cruelty. We were specimens, flesh to be sorted, and yet some part of me still resisted. Not with action, never that, but with thought. I would close my eyes in the darkness of the sleep cycle and imagine my mother's voice reading to me from the Codex of Terror. I would taste the smell of home, the oil smoke from the census lamps, the burnt temps of Risa coffee on her breath. These memories were my shield. My last rebellion. Then came the first cut. We were separated into groups. I was one of 17 chosen for the deep observation wing, a chamber beneath even the dormitorium. The walls here pulsed faintly with power, and the air was thick with incense designed to calm the nerves. A false comfort. We were strapped into chairs. Needles probed our skulls. I remember the red-robed figure leaning close, breath metallic, whispering in high Gothic, "You are seen." I do not recall the pain, only the cold. Days passed, or what we thought were days. Time had begun to blur. They kept the lights constant to erode our rhythm. Some of us began to twitch in our sleep. Others muttered to themselves in tongues they had never learned. We were being pushed, not physically, but mentally. They wanted to know what broke first, memory or reason. And one by one, things began to break. I woke once to find a boy across from me, staring blankly at his own hands, whispering, "The Emperor devours his sons. The Emperor devours his sons." He said it over and over, as if the words had been carved into his mind. He was gone the next cycle. I learned to hide my fear. I learned to quiet my thoughts, even to myself. And in doing so, I began to forget. Not just my name, my face, my voice, what color my eyes had been. I was becoming blank, and they were watching, always watching, waiting for the blank canvas they could begin to paint. I did not know it then, but this erasure, this unmaking, was the first true step toward becoming a custodian. We were taken to the reflection chamber after 13 cycles, though the number meant little in a place. where light never dimmed and hunger was managed by intravenous drip. It was not a room, not truly, more like a cathedral sculpted from silence. There were no icons on the walls, no statues of the emperor or saints, only mirrors, dozens of them, each one different in shape, in angle, in distortion. Some stretched your face into a mockery. Others showed you as older, broken, monstrous. A few reflected nothing at all. We were made to walk between them. No instruction, no voice, just the quiet thrum of the Emperor's machinery somewhere above. The others hesitated. One boy reached out to touch a mirror and gasped, not from pain, but recognition. He began to weep and wouldn't stop. They removed him quickly. We never saw him again. I stepped forward, not with courage, but because waiting was worse than walking. Each mirror caught a flicker of me, a silhouette, a shadow. In one, I looked like my father, or how I imagined he might have looked. In another, I was a warrior, tall and radiant, clad in golden armor that pulsed with a light from no sun. And in the final mirror, closest to the center of the chamber, I saw nothing. No face, no eyes, just emptiness in the shape of a boy. It felt right. I stood before that mirror longer than the rest. Something in its void seemed to reach into me, plucking at the unraveling strands of who I had been. And for the first time, I felt not fear, but belonging, as though the absence it showed me was not a loss, but a gift. When the acolytes came, they did not pull me away. They marked my name on a slate I would never see, and led me to the upper levels, not to freedom, but to something worse. Confirmation. They gathered the chosen 6 of us from the original group of over 100. We were lined up before a gate of black adamantium inscribed with sigils so old they breathed. A priest recited a litany in a language none of us knew, and then the gate opened with the sound of stone grinding on bone. Beyond it lay the Hall of Thresholds, where the physical transformations would begin. We were told nothing, only that beyond this point we could not turn back. Before we stepped through, I looked over my shoulder, not to find comfort that was long dead, but to ensure I remembered the direction I came from. Downward, a hand touched my shoulder. One of the robed custodians, towering above us all, face hidden behind a helm wrought like a weeping angel. He said nothing, but the gesture was not unkind. He knew. He had once stood here too, and then I passed through the gate and felt it close behind me like a tomb sealing shut. Whatever I had been, child, son, boy, was buried in that moment, in its place. A silence deeper than fear settled into my bones. I was not yet a custodian, but I was no longer anything else. There is a lie in the galaxy that war is the crucible in which warriors are forged. For the Adeptus Custodes, that crucible comes long before battle. It begins in the dark, where bone is broken and rebuilt, where the soul is unstitched from its vessel and rewoven in the Emperor's image. The reshaping does not begin with armor or oath. It begins with the destruction of what remains, the quiet, methodical murder of humanity, piece by piece, until only purpose survives. We were not given names, not given reasons, only numbers and a schedule too complex for our broken minds to follow. Each morning, if one could call it that, brought us into the inner sancta of the lights, where the air was heavy with chemical myrrh and machin oil. There, the tech priests of the cult Mechanicus labored not to heal, but to unmake and refashion. They did not speak to us, not once. We were not their charges. We were raw material, They began with the bones. Injectors sank into our flesh like the kisses of venomous insects, filling our marrow with agents that burned with a heat I still taste in dreams. Growth, stimulants, structural binding proteins keyed to the Custodes genome template. Not Astartes, no, never that. This was purer, more refined. But with every enhancement, our bodies resisted. Fever, convulsions, muscle failure, blood like oil. Some of us awoke screaming. Some never awoke at all. I remember one boy, lean, quiet, his eyes always tracking the corners of the room. He began to change faster than the rest. Skin turned translucent. His joints cracked with every breath. He tried to walk one morning and collapsed, bones like glass under his own weight. They did not mourn him. They recorded the failure, removed the body, and wheeled in another stretcher. By that point, none of us asked where the new ones came from. We were modified down to the cell. Muscles became dense, corded with synthetic sinew. Reflexes reprogrammed. Our blood itself rebalanced with machine-compatible enzymes. Every alteration was tested. Every error corrected. I spent one night, or perhaps a day. Time was an illusion in that place, vomiting black sludge as my liver underwent accelerated genetic conversion. They left me on the floor, shaking until the process completed. Only then did the servitors return to collect me. But worse than the physical breaking was the slow erosion of self. Between procedures, they showed us images, patterns, tapestries of imperial history, rendered in pulses of light and color. There were no words, no context, just flashes of war, fire, angels in gold, and a throne that burned at the heart of everything. These were not lessons. They were programming. After days of exposure, I began to see the images in my sleep, not as dreams, but memories. One morning, I looked at my hands and realized I could no longer recall what they used to look like. The lines were wrong. The color wrong. Even the shape had begun to change. They were becoming something else. Something greater. Something terrible. And in that realization, I felt the first stirrings of a new truth. I was being forged not in fire, but in silence and science. Not into a warrior, but into a relic. They say the Emperor watches over all his subjects, that his gaze burns eternal through the Astronacon, guiding ships through the void. But here, in the vaults beneath the palace, there were no stars to chart. Only the hands of men acting as his will. Perhaps that's why it hurt more, because it wasn't divine flame that broke us. It was scalpels and sutures and the quiet whisper of steel against bone that the second phase of our reshaping targeted the brain. They called it neuroarchitectural alignment, a phrase polished by scholars, sterile in its elegance. But what it meant was this: our minds were rewritten, not wiped. That would have been easier. Instead, they kept what was useful: reaction patterns, spatial awareness, survival instincts, and overlaid them with knowledge not meant for children or even men. Languages spoken only by the priesthood of terror. Tactical doctrines refined over 10,000 years. The full chronicle of the Custodes, etched into neural lattice-like scripture, burned into flesh. I remember the first time I felt it happen. I had been dreaming, or thought I had. A vast plain of glass stretched before me, filled with armored giants locked in ritual combat. I watched their every move, understood each feint, each parry, as if I had trained beside them for decades. When I woke, I recited the litany of iron word for word, a prayer I had never heard before, and I was not alone. The others spoke in tongues we had not known the week before. Some wept from the sheer pressure inside their skulls. Others stared into nothingness, lips trembling with verses from ages long past. We began to see things differently. Movements slowed down, sounds sharpened. I could hear the flicker of a lumen panel 3 corridors away. I could taste the copper tents of power lines humming behind the walls. Time stretched, bent, collapsed. They said it was working, that we were integrating, but none of us felt whole, just layered. Like skin over skin, identity over identity. What was left underneath? No one could say . And then came the surgeries. They did not announce them. You were simply summoned. A blank-faced servitor would appear, beckon with a single mechanical arm, and you would rise, walk, enter the chamber. I remember lying on the table, restraints warm from the last occupant. The light above me was too bright to focus on, but in its center was a sigil, the Aquila wings extended, eyes blind. I do not remember pain. They made sure of that. But I remember the smell. Burned protein, clean metal, ozone. My skull was opened and rebuilt. My nerves reinforced with conductive fiber to link me directly to power armor not yet forged. Micro-reactors implanted in my chest to sustain the metabolic demands of my new form. My heartbeat slowed to 30 pulses per minute. My breath became a controlled act of necessity, not reflex. When I awoke, I did not recognize myself. My chest rose higher. My limbs no longer ached with hunger. My thoughts were ... still, not empty, just ... disciplined. I knew what I had been. I understood what I was becoming. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the incense settled and the prayers of the Mechanicus faded, I still remembered my mother's voice, calling me in the dark. But it was growing fainter. There came a day when we were taken to the Chamber of Mirrors once more, not the same as before, but deeper, colder. This time there were no warped reflections, no playful distortions. Only a single slab of polished black obsidian mounted to the far wall, tall as a titan's chest plate, and framed by brass circuitry that pulsed like veins beneath the surface. The gene writes called it the null reflection. It did not show you as you were. It showed you as the Imperium required you to be. One by one, we were made to stand before it. When my turn came, I did not expect to feel anything. But as I stood in front of that mirror, the air became heavy, pressing in around my chest as if the room itself disapproved of me. The reflection was not wrong. It was accurate, terrifyingly so. I stood taller now, my spine straighter, shoulders broadened unnaturally. The lines of my skull refined into sharp, angular purpose. But it was the eyes that chilled me. They were not mine. Not because the color had changed, though it had. Not because the pupils had narrowed or the sclera had turned faintly gold. No, it was because they looked at me, as if the reflection was independent, watching, judging, and when it blinked a moment after I did, not in unison, but delayed, I understood. This was not a mirror. It was a test. I did not move. I stared. The eyes narrowed. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, they nodded, and the obsidian went dark. After that, we were no longer kept with the rest. They moved us, those of us who had survived, to the outer sanctum of the Hall of Coalescence, where true custodians began their final phase of preparation. We were still initiates, unworthy of the armor. far from the rank of shield captain or tribune, but something had changed in how they looked at us. There was less curiosity now, more ... expectation, as though we had crossed a threshold, and there could be no return. The priests did not speak to us, but the custodians did, one by one, over weeks or months. The difference blurred. They began to appear, never more than one at a time, never speaking of themselves. They taught us not in words, but in acts. One showed me how to balance my breath with my strike during a training duel. Another corrected my stance with a single glance. Their presence was crushing, each movement a sermon, each silence a judgment. And yet, there was something kind in it too. Not softness, but ... clarity. They wanted us to survive. Not because they cared for us as individuals, but because they respected the role we would bear. If we endured, some did not. I remember the night a boy, a strong one, already near 7 feet tall, simply walked into the electrochasm and let it take him. No one stopped him. No alarms sounded. His body was consumed in silence, the only mark of his passing a flicker in the corridor lights. I asked one of the custodians later why they hadn't intervened. He said, because he chose the only freedom left to him, and then he walked away. I had believed the pain was over, that the reshaping had been the final crucible. Muscles torn and reforged, memories rewritten, bones restructured to bear the weight of centuries. But what they did not tell us was that all of that had been preparation, not for war, not for armor, but for silence. They brought us one at a time into the antechamber. It was bare. No sigils, no icons, no incense. Just a simple black threshold, no wider than a door, pulsing faintly with light that was not quite light. I remember how the custodian who led me there stood aside without speaking, and how the server skull behind him recorded my expression as I stepped through. Beyond the threshold, there was nothing, no sound, no temperature, no sense of dimension, just the breathless vacuum of sensory deprivation. Not space, not the cold void between stars, but something more ancient. Something buried in the silence between heartbeats. My feet touched no floor. My body felt weightless, yet restrained. I could not see. I could not hear. I could not move, and yet I was not alone, not at first. The memories came, sharp and sudden. My mother's eyes, the day they took me, the first time I bled from the grafting wounds, the face of the boy who died whispering, "The Emperor devours his sons." All of it returned, unbidden, like a wave breaking inside my skull. For a time, I screamed. Not with sound, there was no sound here, but in thought, in desperation, in primal refusal. The silence did not answer. It only listened. Time shattered. I do not know how long I floated in that void. Minutes, hours, years, all of it bled together. And then came the voice. Not a voice I heard, but one I felt in the marrow of my altered bones. It was not the Emperor. No, I am not so foolish. But it felt like him, or like the echo of his will pressed through 1,000 layers of ritual, faith, and golden circuitry. The voice did not speak in words. It did not comfort or command. It simply was. In its presence, I was nothing, not even dust. I understood, then, the truth that every custodian bears alone. We are not made to be heroes. We are made to be walls, silent, faceless, immovable. We do not fight for the Emperor. We stand for him between his broken body and the dying stars. the silence showed me the weight of that duty. One by one, my memories faded. Not stolen, I could still reach for them, but distant, like voices down a long corridor. The fear faded too. Then the pain. Then even my sense of self. I could have floated there forever. And perhaps I did. Perhaps a part of me still does. When the threshold opened again, I stumbled out. The same custodian was waiting. He caught me before I fell. I looked up at him, expecting words, affirmation. Something, but he only placed one hand over my chest, where the Aquila would one day rest, and nodded once. He had seen the silence too, and he knew I had returned changed. They did not ask us what we saw in the silence. That was never the point. To speak of it was to break it, and those who emerged broken were taken away without ceremony. We never saw them again. No explanation, no rites. Only the soft hiss of hydraulics as the walls closed behind them. Their names, if we still remembered them, were erased even from the lips of memory. But for those of us who endured, something unspoken passed between us. A glance, a posture, the way we carried ourselves afterward. Lighter, perhaps, or heavier. No one was quite the same. One initiate, who had once muttered prayers before every training exercise, now knelt in perfect stillness before the golden symbol of the Aquila, and did not rise until summoned. Another, once sharp-tongued and defiant, now moved with such restraint it was as if he feared disturbing the air itself. The silence had not cleansed us. It had hollowed us out, and in the hollows, something vast had settled. They began to call us Ascendants. We were given new garments, robes of black trimmed with red, lined with gold thread not visible under normal light. The script woven into them bore no readable language. We asked no questions. Even the youngest among us understood that curiosity had no place here. Only obedience. Only preparation. The training that followed was unlike anything before. We were no longer taught in groups. Each of us now had a custodian shadow. Mine was a giant of a man, silent, unreadable, whose armor bore faint scoring from blades I could not name. He never removed his helm, never spoke a word, but every gesture he made was exact, deliberate. When he raised his hand, I moved. When he waited, I listened. In the silence between instruction, I began to hear more than just movement. I began to feel his expectation, his disapproval, his rare nod of assent. We trained in impossible conditions. Rooms that shifted underfoot. Gravity wells that twisted orientation. Simulations layered with false enemies and false allies, all designed to break our instincts. But the silence had changed us. Thought and motion were no longer separate. We did not react. We anticipated. We were taught to fight, not as Astartes' blunt force incarnate, but as sentinels of living purpose. Every strike had meaning. Every movement preserved balance. One day, my custodian led me to a vault. Its doors were sealed with sigils that shimmered at the edge of sight. Inside was a single object, a training spear, taller than I, weighted with gravitic distortion fields and crowned with a blade that sang against the air. I reached for it, expecting resistance. There was none. The moment my fingers closed around the haft, I knew. This was not a weapon. It was an extension of thought, of faith, of silence. It pulsed with a rhythm I recognized, though I had never heard it before, the heartbeat of terror itself. My custodian watched me turn the weapon once, twice, then lower it across my chest. He tilted his head. And in a voice that rasped like old stone, he spoke the first words I had heard from him. "Now, you begin." And with those 3 syllables, I realized ... The reshaping had not ended. It had only just begun. From that moment forward, we were no longer tested for survival. We were tested for understanding. The vaults beneath the Imperial Palace stretched beyond reason, vast catacombs of polished steel and whispering stone, each chamber holding challenges designed not to measure strength, but intention. I was led through sanctums filled with ancient war constructs, designed to anticipate every move, sparred against mock custodians whose neural templates had been etched with the instincts of 10,000 fallen warriors, and made to navigate archives where a single incorrect gesture could trigger catastrophic collapse. But none of that compared to the chamber they called the Voxless Shrine. It was a sphere. Perfect, seamless, suspended in the center of a gravity-null cradle. Inside, there was no up, no down, only motion, only thought. A puzzle built for silence. I was told nothing, only that I must remain inside for as long as it took to hear what could not be heard. The door sealed. I drifted, waited. At first, I listened for sounds. My own heartbeat, my breath, the creak of muscle against cloth, but there was nothing. Then I listened for thought, but even my mind seemed muffled, as if it too were wrapped in some unseen cocoon. That was when the questions came, not from outside, from within. "Who are you?" it asked, with no words. "What remains of the child who once walked Tara's streets? What would you do if released? What would you become if not bound by duty?" At first I fought the voice, clung to the liturgies etched in my mind, recited the catechism of silence, the laws of the 10,000, the litany of selfless vigilance. But the questions did not stop. They twisted, grew quiet, then returned louder. They knew every crack, every forgotten hope. They pulled at the one thing left untouched by surgery or science. My will. I do not know how long I was inside. When the chamber finally opened, I stepped out, trembling, not with fear, but with awe. I had not defeated the questions. I had not answered them, but I had endured them. That, I would learn, was all that mattered. Only 4 of us emerged. The others either never left or left changed in ways that rendered them unfit to continue. I asked no questions. Neither did the others. Their absence was not betrayal nor failure. It was simply proof that not all are meant to carry the weight of silence. We were brought before a custodian tribunal soon after 6 figures in gold. Their armor so aged and battle-scarred, it shimmered like myth. They asked nothing, simply watched. One by one, we stood before them. They read us not by speech or gesture, but by posture, gaze, the breath before the bow. When I knelt, the spear still across my back, I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace, not comfort, not warmth, but the certainty that I was in the presence of those who had seen what I had seen, who bore the same invisible burden. When the tribunal adjourned, one of them, a massive figure with a scar across his chest plate shaped like a burning star, stepped forward and placed his hand on my shoulder. "There is no silence in death," he said. "Only silence in service. Remember that." I did. I do, and as the vaults prepared to open for the final trial, I understood the silence had not hollowed me out. It had made room for him. The armor is not given. It is not won. It is not inherited. It is earned in the most secretive ceremony of the Imperium, a rite unseen by the masses. unknown to the stars, performed not with trumpets or banners, but in the low hum of sealed vaults beneath the Palace of Terror. I stood naked before the forge, not unclothed, stripped of everything, identity, past, even the remnants of pride that had clung like dust to the folds of my transformation. I had passed the trials of flesh, the crucible of thought, the silence of will. But this was the final unmaking. Around me, the artisans of the Legio Custodes moved like shadows carved from gold. Each one bore the title of Fabricator Sanctum, and their voices were litanies in motion, hands sculpting sigils in the air, marking the rites that would bind soul to steel. I felt nothing, not fear, not excitement, only a strange detachment, like watching the final flicker of a dream as waking takes hold. Before me stood the armor, not a replica, not a training suit. This was mine, forged for me and me alone, each plate cast with the expectations of the Imperium, each segment a prayer turned to alloy. It stood upon a server frame, half shrouded in incense, its eyes dim, helm tilted forward as if in mourning or benediction. I approached. The first touch was electric. Not the sting of energy, but the sensation of ... recognition, as if the armor remembered me before I had even worn it. The servitors stepped back. The custodians watched in silence. No instructions, no guiding words. This was the final measure, to see if I was truly ready. I stepped into the greaves. They sealed with a hiss that echoed like a tomb locking shut. The cuirass followed, heavy, sacred, etched with the twin-headed Aquila and the silent oath of the 10,000. When the gauntlet sealed, I felt my pulse slow, my vision sharpen. The world became distant, yet clearer. Not dulled, refined. Then came the helm. It did not descend like a crown. It closed like judgment. When the Vox grill activated, the first breath I drew was not mine. It was centuries of tradition whispered through gold and flame. The helmet sealed with a soft chime, not mechanical, but musical. A note struck only once in a lifetime. I was no longer a candidate. I was custodian. But there was no applause, no celebration, only silence. The armor did not grant me power. It reminded me of it, of what I was now tasked to defend, and of what I had surrendered to do so. I walked from the forge with measured steps, flanked by warriors who had stood their vigil for millennia. Some had never spoken since the heresy. Some had watched the galaxy fracture again and again. None of them looked at me. Not directly, not yet. I had earned the armor, but not their names. That would come later, if I survived. The gates opened ahead, revealing the first sight of terror I had seen since the day they took me. But I no longer wept for it, because I no longer belonged to it. I belonged to him. I was assigned no unit, no rank, no title. The Custodes do not form squads or battalions like the Astra Militarum. We are not legions. We are not brothers. We are sentinels. Alone or in pairs, chosen by purpose, not hierarchy. I was given a designation, a sigil that shimmered across the back of my cuirass, and from that moment onward, I existed not as a man, but as a response to threat, to doubt, to the dying of the Emperor's light. My first assignment was not a battlefield, it was a door. The Hall of Illumination lies deep within the Imperial Palace, a vault so ancient that some say it predates even the Horus heresy. Its contents remain unknown to me even now, and perhaps forever. My task was simple. Stand before it, breathe, watch, endure. I stood there for 7 days, no sleep, no food. My armor sustained me. My thoughts were still. They told us nothing of the purpose of the hall. But as I stood, I began to feel the presence behind the walls. Not a person, not a machine, but a weight, as if the room itself remembered secrets older than stars. I heard whispers, not with my ears, but through my armor, like echoes bouncing across the inner surface of my helm. I could not understand the words, only their sorrow. And on the 7th day, the door trembled. It did not open. It did not glow. It simply shuddered, as if something within had stirred. For one breathless moment, I believed it would speak. But then it fell still. The whispers faded. A custodian approached me then, not the one who trained me. An older one, his armor dented and worn, bearing the crimson tassels of the Heteron Guard. He nodded toward the gate. "You heard it," he said. It was not a question. I answered nothing. He studied me for a moment, then turned away. But just before he vanished into the shadows of the archway, he paused. "They say sometimes the Emperor speaks," he murmured, "but only to those who have forgotten how to listen." I remained at that post for another 9 days. After that, I was rotated to the watchtowers above the Lion's Gate, a view of terror few ever see. The stars were distant and faint, veiled behind the defense grid and the smog of endless procession. Pilgrims marched below, their chants faint but constant. I watched them pass like rivers of flesh, never looking up, never aware that their salvation or annihilation stood quietly above them. That is when I began to feel it. The separation, the distance, not just from humanity, but from being human. I did not ache. I did not hunger. I did not doubt. And yet, I remembered that child who once walked beside his mother beneath these skies, whose name had been erased, but whose heartbeat once had sounded with fear and hope. Was he still there? Or had the armor sealed him away forever? The questions stirred only when the vigil grew quiet in the breath between prayers. The flicker of a candle extinguished by time. But the 10,000 do not flinch from questions. We simply wait for the answers, even if they take 10,000 years. They say we are immortal, that the custodians do not die, only disappear, returned to the vaults or to secrets too sacred for memory. But I have seen death in gold. I have stood over the shattered remains of those I once trained beside. Their armor cracked like broken tombs, the light in their helms flickering out without fanfare. Even gods bleed, if only in silence. But this chapter, my final recollection, is not about death. It is about what remains. It was during the 9th vigil of the Black Bastion on the outer ring of the Imperial precinct. The warp storms had raged for weeks. Communications were fragmentary. Something stirred beyond the veil. Not demonic, not Xenos, but wrong. The Custodes do not panic. We prepare. And so I was stationed with 5 others, each a monument to stillness. As the shadows began to deepen, that was when the rumors started. Some said the Astronomicon pulsed, irregularly, its flames spasming like a dying heart. Others whispered of custodians, speaking in tongues unknown to even the Genitar priests. Of figures glimpsed walking the empty galleries beneath the Emperor's throne, robes of burning white faces indistinct. We were told nothing. And yet, we all felt it. The turning of something vast, a weight pressing from the inside, like breath caught in the lungs of reality. On the 5th night, I heard the voice again, not as I had heard it in the silence, not hollow or divine, but personal. It spoke not in commands, but in remembrance. You chose this. The words echoed through my armor, not in defiance, but in reflection, as though some part of me, buried deep beneath flesh, steel, silence, had awakened, if only for a moment, to ask why. Why I had stood for centuries without sleep, without question. Why I had surrendered name, self, life. Why I had become myth instead of man. And the answer was peace, not joy, not fulfillment. Just peace. The kind that comes from knowing. I had stood before the enemy and not flinched. I had held the line, not in battle, but in existence. I had been seen by the Emperor, perhaps, or by the idea of him that lives within all custodians. And I had not broken when the warp storms passed, and the black bastion fell silent again. I returned to the vaults beneath the palace. There the light was dim, the air cold, the silence heavier than I remembered. My armor was placed on the sanctified rack. My name, such as it was, entered into the living steel of the hall of remembered service. I stood once more in the antechamber, where I had first beheld my reflection, and I saw nothing, no boy, no warrior, no shadow, just gold, burning, waiting. I am custodian. I do not age. I do not falter. I do not sleep. But sometimes, when the stars flicker wrong, and the wind carries whispers through the stone of the palace, I remember her voice, my mother, telling me to be more. I am. But I wonder, in moments of absolute silence, whether she would recognize me now, or whether even she would turn away from what I have become, a sentinel, a statue carved from duty, a weapon forged not to strike, but to stand forever.